This is a Comics Alternative Special, a roundtable discussion on children's and young adult comics. Hello and welcome to a special episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Gwen, and we're two people with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this episode, Gwen and I have a roundtable discussion with Carly Marie Grice and Joe Sutliff Sanders. Both are contributors to Gwen's coedited new book, Graphic Novels for Children and Young Adults. And we have a great discussion on not only this book, but the state of children's and YA graphic novels. But before we get to that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But often, you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
That's right, Derek. And I was actually looking through DCBS this morning, and a number of the comics that are mentioned in the chapters for graphic novels for children and young adults are available for 30, 35, even 50% off. So if you're reading our collection and you want to pick up some of the comics that are referenced in it, DCBS is the place to go.
That's right. It's a great place to find wonderful prices on not only comics for young readers, but all kind of comics. That's dcbservice.com. You got to go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Gwen and Derek sent you. You know, Gwen, one of the things I'd recommend that our listeners do is, first and foremost, get a copy of your and Michelle's new book, Graphic Novels for Children and Young Adults, and then as they read it, to go through the website of DCB Service and check off and order those books that you and your various contributors mention.
Absolutely. And, you know, I want to make sure that we give full credit to Michelle Anna Bate. She's a professor of children's and YA literature at The Ohio State University. She's also a professor of English there. She's an amazing scholar, and I'm sorry she couldn't join us today. We had some technological snafus going on. But Michelle and I really spent a lot of time thinking about trying to make this collection as representative as possible, and you're going to hear that in our roundtable for sure. But there's some really great comics here, and we'd love people to read them as well as our book.
Yeah, we really did have a nice conversation, and I want to thank both Carly and Joe for being a part of it, and you for initiating this roundtable discussion. So you want to go ahead and get to that recording?
Absolutely. Well, Derek, I thought we'd start off by introducing everyone who's participating today. Unfortunately, my co-editor, Dr. Michelle Abate, can't be with us today. There were some technological difficulties on her end, but we are really fortunate to have two of our contributors with us today. The first is Dr. Joe Sutliff Sanders. He's a professor at Kansas State University, and he is, I believe, very heavily involved in their children's and young adult lit program there, and also teaches comics studies. And we have with us Carly Marie Grice, who is just finishing up her doctorate at The Ohio State University. And Carly, I think you got some good news recently professionally.
Oh, yes, I've recently accepted an assistant professor job at Millikan University. So
congratulations.
Congratulations, Carly. I wanted to make sure I wasn't sure where you were at, so I want to make sure that you could tell everybody that great news. And Derek, I thought that we might start off today with me talking a little bit about the genesis of the book itself, and then maybe turn things over to Joe and to Carly to talk about their entries in the collection.
Yeah, that sounds great.
All right. So maybe 3 years ago now, Michelle contacted me and asked if I would want to co-edit a book on graphic novels for children and young adults. And I really did. At the time, there weren't as many critical resources on children's comics as one would have liked. And we really felt that there was a need that this book would fill. And when we put out a call for papers, we were overwhelmed by the response. We had over 50 abstracts that were sent to us, and all of them were of wonderful quality. So we really were blessed with such a large number. And initially, we were very ambitious and put together a proposal that included almost all of them. But once we started talking to the University Press of Mississippi about this project, and they wanted us to come on board with the children's literature imprint that they were just starting out, they said, that would make a very, very long book. And so we put together another proposal, and ultimately they settled on 21 chapters, which if you're, typically doing an edited collection, usually you don't have that kind of leeway. So I want to start off by really tipping my hat to BJ Singh and then Katie Keene at University Press of Mississippi for having such faith in this project, and for feeling that as one of the first books out there that really was dealing with a critical examination of children's YLIT, that they were willing to afford us that size of collection, because it's quite long.
Yeah, that's a lot of essays in a collection of this sort.
It really is. And, what we basically did was we set it up with a general introduction that talks about the field. And then we have a number of parts. So the first part is graphic novels as comic storytelling, word and image, form, and genre. And in this section, we're really talking about the materiality of comics. In the next section, hybrid comics, transmedial storytelling, and graphic novels and adaptation. We have scholars who are looking at the way that comics very often have been generated out of adaptation. So we're looking at titles there like Coraline and City of Ember, but also a really exciting essay on My Little Pony and Transmedial Strategies by Aaron Cashton. So a lot of really great essays in that section. There's a section on the pedagogy of comics. It's called The Pedagogy of the Panel, Comic Storytelling in the Classroom, and that's looking both at the way that high school and grade school teachers might utilize comics in the classroom, and then how academics might use them in their children's and YA Lit courses or courses on comics for young people. We have a section on representing gender and sexuality in the comics medium. And then we have a section on drawing on identity, history, politics, and culture. And the collection concludes with a wonderful coda by Dr. Joe Sutliff Sanders called The Future of Children's and YA Comics. And so really excited about this collection and excited to talk about it today.
Yeah, and I think one of the beauties of a collection like this, and, the first of its kind, is that it allows us on this roundtable not only to talk about the kind of research that each of you are doing and have specifically done for this book that Gwen and Michelle edited, but also just the state of comics within children's and young adult literature as a whole.
Right. And, one of the things that's so complicated about this is, I began as a children's literature scholar, and I developed a deep interest in comics. But one of the things that distinguishes children's and YA comics from mainstream text-only narratives is that there are multiple ways that children's and YA comics can be published and distributed. This is very different than mainstream children's lit, which typically is funneled through a number of major publishers. Over the last 10 or 15 years, you've seen mainstream publishers begin to adopt graphic novel imprints. But even today, if you're looking at quote unquote YA comics, you're looking at things that could be distributed by, a comics distributor. You could be looking at things that show up in brick and mortar stores. You could be looking at web comics. So even just defining what we mean by the phrase children's and why comics was a challenge for Michelle and for me, and almost everyone who writes in this volume in one way or another touches on that. I'd love to perhaps bring in Joe, because Joe, I know that we set you with quite a task. We actually wanted you to talk about the future of comics and children's comics and YA novels. And I just wonder if you want to maybe comment a little bit on your piece and on how some of those issues may be filtered into what you were doing.
Yeah, sure. So what happened originally was I saw the call for papers come out for this volume, and I thought, well, boy, I'd sure love to be in that. And then I looked at the other things I had to do and realized there was no way I could possibly get anything written in that amount of time. And so I even talked with one or both of you at one point about that and said, you guys are going to have such a great book, and I wish I could be part of it, but I can't because of this. And then and you guys said, oh, well, that's fine, And then later on came back and said, listen, nobody wanted to do anything about digital comics, and we feel like we really need that for it to be a complete book. And you're the person we know who does this, so will you please write something? And I actually wrote an email and then deleted it. The email said, that's so sweet of you, but I can't possibly do it. Here's why. And then I started writing who I thought could do it instead. And I couldn't come up with anybody who was at a better point in their lives than I was to do it. And so I just deleted it all and said, you know what? Sure, I'll do it.
Oh, well, we're very grateful, Joe.
Well, and I should say, too, that one of the things that happened really early on in this was that I said to Michelle and Gwen that I wasn't sure I was going to find anything interesting. And I wanted it to be okay for me to write a chapter that said, basically, you know what? There aren't any good digital children's comics. So there you go. Merry Christmas. Everything sucks. That's what I expected to find. And before I went ahead with the project, I got permission for that to be a valid conclusion. So that was really cool, because it meant that I went in not under any kind of obligation to say anything really positive or interesting or to say anything. Yeah, okay, it had to be interesting, but it didn't have to be positive about the field. It could be, in fact, quite negative, pessimistic. In the end, that's not what I had to do, but I had that freedom, which meant that when I came up with happy, positive things to say, they were genuine. They weren't just me trying to force something.
Sure.
So then I wound up doing two things to write this paper. One was that I dived into the scholarship I could find about electronic comics, and there was very little. And I dived into the new electronic comics that I could find, and there were quite a lot of those. So as far as the scholarship goes, right at the turn into the current century, there was this sudden explosion of discussion about electronic comics and what those would look like. And what those
right.
would do. And that really settled down. There was a lot of really angry fighting for a few years, and then it just kind of went. I didn't go away entirely, but it calmed down considerably, and not a whole lot of work was being done there. And then, as far as the comics themselves went, what I found was that there was an awful lot out there, but the vast majority of it was stuff that had been scanned from print comics, and it was available electronically, and it was, in fact, a comic book. So it was an electronic comic in that sense, but it wasn't designed to be electronic originally. Very little of it was designed to be read electronically from the beginning.
Right.
And those comics that were designed to be electronic from the beginning were really uninteresting. That most of them were really uninteresting, and They just wanted to. They were designed to be on a screen, but they still thought of themselves as paper comics, and so that was really disappointing. Then some positive things happened, but I'll take a moment before I get into those and ask if you have any questions so far, because I realize I'm talking an awful lot.
No, I mean, I think you're really bringing up an important point. The idea that are there people out there working who really want to take advantage of what digital has to offer and are creating comics from the ground up with that in mind? And it seems to me that your research indicates that not that many people are there yet.
Yes, that's right. Not that many people were there yet. Now, there were some people experimenting with this. There were some independent comics creators experimenting with it, though the vast majority of them were writing for adults and really were aggressively not for children. And I don't mean just like they had naughty words or something like that. I mean that they were they were going out of their way to engage with things that were part of adult culture and to make it clear that they were holding themselves at arm's length from children's or teen culture or anything like that. So, however, there were a few places where there was some interesting work being done. Marvel had started to play around with the idea of comics written for digital release, and that we're actually trying to take advantage of the fact that they were in a digital format. And most of these were more gimmicky than they were actually artistic, but they were trying, and I felt like that earned them some credit. And there was one comic I discovered called Atomic Robo, and Atomic Robo is wonderful. That is a great comic book. And it had been a great comic book in print, and then they decided to make a giveaway digital comic that was original to the form.
Right, and that was by Scott Wegener and Brian Clevenger, right?
Yep,
yeah.
That's right. And that whole series, in print or electronic, is magnificent. Atomic Robo is one of the best discoveries I've had in the last 10 years when it comes to comics. And they did this one-shot story that was fantastic, and it gave me the courage to say, we can ask for more from digital comics than the fact that they are digital and comics. We can ask that they actually think about the medium that they're in and try to use it inventively, creatively, and aesthetically as well. And then there were some other cool things that happened along the way. But it was when I stumbled across the free Atomic Robo comic, which you can get right now on Comixology for free. That was the point when I went, oh, wait a minute. There are actually people doing some really great artistic, aesthetically challenging pieces for young readers in the comics format in an electronic medium.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I find this particularly fascinating in light of the stuff that I tend to do with web comics. And I know we need to get to Carly and then talk about, I guess, the vast majority of the book, which is devoted to print medium. But Joe, I'm curious in terms of how you're defining electronic or digital comics. In what ways do you, in your work, distinguish digital comics from web comics? Because to me, the latter is where the movers and shakers with children's and young adult graphic narrative, if you want to call it that. I mean, that's where everything's really taking place.
Well, I have to say, first of all, it never occurred to me to distinguish between digital and web. Things on the web are composed digitally, and so I always thought of them that way. So I'll look forward to explaining that distinction. I also have to say, it sounds like you might know a lot more about this than I do. Because, the stuff that I found, especially when I was writing this essay, the stuff that was on the web for children was pretty awful. The stuff that I found on Comixology for children, there were some hidden gems in there. But I didn't find anything that was on the web that I thought was really remarkable. So maybe you need to tell us about this.
Well, when it comes to digital comics, again, depending on how you define it, that's probably not my forte. In many of my classes at UT Dallas, and I'm in the Arts and Technology program, I teach webcomics often. And the way that I make the distinction with my students is that, and you're right, that webcomics are comics that are produced digitally or electronically for our consumption, on computing devices. But the difference between webcomics and digital comics is that all webcomics are digital comics, but not all digital comics are webcomics. And what I mean by that is that the title itself, the designation webcomics, that the web part of that term is basically what defines a webcomic. In other words, a webcomic is one in which you absolutely need a browser designed for the World Wide Web in order to consume it. And then a digital comic, which you can consume through a web browser, but not necessarily, would be everything else. So, for instance, a great example, I think, of a webcomic for young readers is something that I know Gwen and I have discussed on the show in the past, and that is Tony Cliff's Delilah Dirk stories, which began as a webcomic. Now they've become print books. And to me, the fascinating thing about webcomics and children's and young adult comics is many of them first start off as a webcomic, and then they gain a lot of attention. Maybe they're kickstarted or have a successful Patreon program, and then a publisher notices them, and then it turns into a print publication. And that may be how they're primarily known afterward, that people don't know, oh, it started off as a webcomic. Now, an example of a digital comic are some of the ones that you had mentioned, right? So a lot of the things coming through, let's say, Marvel, DC. You mentioned in your essay Thrillbent, what Mark Waid does. And, even though you can consume those comics through a web browser, you don't necessarily need a web browser in order to read them. But a webcomic is one that you can only really consume those through a web browser because of their very design, the way that they're set up.
Yeah. Okay. Well, certainly that makes sense. I see what you're saying now. So digital comics is the larger term. Web comics, it fits within digital comics, and it means digital comics that you consume using a web browser. Yeah. Certainly that makes sense. And I think it also makes a lot of sense because there are going to be strengths and limitations, and more limitations come to mind at the moment than strengths when you have it through a web browser, as opposed to when you view it, for example, through Comixology, when you have some software that is specifically designed to display web comics, or to display digital comics. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
And don't, sorry, go ahead. I didn't know
Delilah Kirk was originally a digital comic.
Or a webcomic,
yeah. I enjoy those print books an awful lot.
Well, Joe, one thing that I was going to ask you was, in your essay and in other work that I've seen you do, you talk a lot about pacing. And I think maybe, is that one of the distinctions with digital comics on a Comixology? A lot of those interesting pacing techniques that you talk about maybe aren't always available through a web browser?
Sure. Or also, one of the things that I have often seen in web comics as opposed to, I guess, non-web digital comics, is that web comics, at least back in the day, had a strong tendency to be written in such a way that they would compel you forward at a pace that was designed by the creator of the story. And I just don't like that as much. I remember there's a book that Roland Barthes wrote, in which he takes this really cantankerous old man position where he's like shaking his fist at movies. I don't like movies. Film, blah. Everybody's excited about film. Give me photographs. And I remember reading that and just kind of rolling my eyes and thinking, oh, you pretentious old man. Well, that's what I'm saying right now is I don't want comics that are going to compel me forward at their pace. That's the thing I like about comics, is that I can consume them at whatever pace I want. So, I think you're right, Gwen, that's a distinction. And it may be one of the reasons that I may even have come across some good web comics and just sort of discarded them because they did this thing and I didn't like it.
Absolutely. Well, Derek, do we want to bring Carly in now maybe and have her talk a little bit about her piece? I did want to sort of point out that one of the things that Michelle and I really felt was missing out of scholarship, especially scholarship coming out of the field of children's literature, where most of us were not trained in visual theory, is that what was missing was a discussion of the way that narrative is brought forward and pushed forward in comics via the visuals. And that is a learning curve that all of us have to go down if we're serious about writing about comics. And so we wanted to make sure that many of the essays in our collection actually did discuss that and had that as a central piece. And Carly's essay, which is called "What is China But a People and Their Visual Stories? The Synthetic and Narratives of Contest in Jean Luen Yang's Boxers and Saints," definitely does that. And you can tell by the complexity of the title that Carly is dealing with a lot of terms and ideas that are central to visual rhetoric and visual theory. So Carly, maybe you could talk to us a little bit, not only about your essay, but maybe about the training that you've received as a sort of younger scholar that enabled you so early in your career to write about visual narrative in the way that you do.
Thank you, Gwen. I think that I would say I've been very blessed to have a rather broad interdisciplinary background academically. So coming from Illinois State University, where I studied specifically English with a specific focus in children's literature, where I got my introduction to comics and graphic novels. Well, graphic novels, if we ignore the comics that I loved as a kid. And it was there that Karen Coates actually really introduced me to the visual theory around multimodality. So really looking at mode and those multimodal texts in the way that the visual and those other modes all come together to create messages and to use things other than just what I had prior to used to read text, just words. She really pushed us to look into everything that came together as a signifier for the text and to draw meaning from that. Mm-hmm. And then coming into OSU, my focus here has been back and forth with kind of multiliteracies, multimodality, and then being very fortunate enough to also do some work with Jared Gardner here, looking at comic studies and kind of pop culture visual theories through him. Mm-hmm. I've just been lucky to have a foot in every field so far.
Absolutely. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about your interest in the work of Jean Luen Yang and a little bit about your essay?
I, first of all, am a self-proclaimed Jean Luen Yang fangirl from the beginning. I adored all of his works. In fact, my master's thesis focused partially on American-born Chinese. And I knew from even then that I wanted whatever scholarship I did, whenever Yang would publish something, that I would be looking at it and trying to marvel at it. But I was really floored when I came across Boxers and Saints. Just the fact that it was the materiality of it was so different.
Why don't we tell our listeners who aren't familiar with it a little bit about that diptych?
Absolutely. Yang's diptych, and really with that term, it's a single narrative or a single story, but it's told through two separate narratives that are actually physically printed as two separate books. So while the title is often written as Boxers and Saints as a complete narrative, the two physical books are actually Boxers and then a separate Saints. They were originally intended to be published separately through actually calendar-wise a separate time, with Boxers coming out first, and then sometime down the line, Saints coming out. And I think that would have, I talk about that in my essay, I think that would have been an interesting difference to the narrative. But when they were published together almost as a box set to remind people to read them together.
Right.
And the materiality of it, not just the physically separate books, but also the fact that if you put the books together on your bookshelf, you can see how they actually visually complete one another with the book covers. So the faces of the protagonist from Boxers, Little Bao, is very similar to the cover of American Born Chinese, cut in half so that it completes the face of the protagonist of Saints, Viviana, or Poor Girl as she was originally known. The other really curious materiality to me is that I would have presumed, looking at a book split like that the author would have intended the narratives to be roughly the same size to kind of suggest this even balance of the weight. But when you look at Boxers and Saints, Boxers is almost double the length of Saints.
Right, and that has an immediate, gives you an immediate sense that I remember when I got them, I thought, is one of these more important than the other?
Yes, absolutely. It's very tangible. And I would almost say, like, speaking to the unconscious, that even as you pick up Boxers, it's a heavier text, both literally and metaphorically, with its double length. And it's also important, all of these things that I kind of talk about in my essay, the way that Yang takes on this through this historical fiction with some fantastic elements. He takes on the dueling narratives, and really I kind of have dual there as both like DUEL and DUAL of the Boxer Rebellion in China, kind of as that response to oppressive Christian and Western colonialism. And by presenting Boxers as that heftier materiality and presenting it as the first in the title and the first book to read, there's a little bit of his effort to kind of work with traditional narratology, as James Phelan kind of talks about the narratives of contest. So the fact that within every narrative, there is the suggestion that there is another alternative competing narrative that exists.
Right.
But Yang, he gives it to us there is no implicit contest. He makes it very explicit, places them next to one another. And he kind of takes on this fact that Phelan suggests certain narratives always have a heavier weight in society based on being privileged. So typically in the West, we would think of the fact that a Christian or a Western narrative, like the one that gets told in Saints, the second text or the second half of the diptych, is already inherently the more privileged narrative within the society of his intended audience, the West. So by putting in Boxers first and doubling its weight, and a few other things that he has done, he instead tries to kind of level the playing field. So I loved that factor of the materiality of the books.
Absolutely. What a great description, Carly. Yeah. That's just amazing. You've done such a nice job of encapsulating what your essay does.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'd like to take your topic of Jean Luen Yang and to kind of use it as a springboard to a broader question when it comes to children's and adolescent graphic novels or comics. And that is, it seems to me that when you're talking about comics or graphic novels to use in the classroom, high school, and, as Gwen, as you do, in terms of a course teaching future educators, right? Things that they can use for younger readers. Yang's name constantly comes up. It's a no-brainer, which leads me to think that this is someone who we could think of as canonical when it comes to children's and adolescent comics. So I want to ask all of you, what do you think? Maybe it's a two-part question. One, or maybe even an either-or question. First, is there what you would consider, even in its loose form, a canon of children's and young adult graphic novels and comics? And then maybe as a companion question, is that a useful question to ask? Is there such thing as a canon? Or maybe an alternative, does our discussion of certain texts and writers as canonical kind of undermine the project of working with and teaching children's and young adult comics?
I'll interestingly take a stab at that one. I think it's fabulous that Yang does kind of come up as this canonical author and his works. And of course, American-Born Chinese has been, since its publication, that changed in so many ways children's literatures to open it up to comics, which had been much more closed prior to that. I love that he was an educator, that he spent time in the classroom, that he's not distanced from kids in his life. Even with his new piece that's coming out, with him have his new nonfiction piece coming out soon. I cannot recall the name of it. Can you guys recall it?
No, I know it's coming out, but
it's about a basketball team that he follows.
Right.
So spends his life, or has spent his life, really engaged with young readers. And I've even seen him speaking to middle schoolers in a library speech, and he is there with them on the most respectful of all levels. So I think Yang is the best, I would say, kind of like contemporary father of comics for children and young adults. And I love that you asked, too, the question that, is it even useful? Should we even have a canon? Particularly because if we're positioning really Yang as the beginning of a twist within making comics for children and young adults a bit more adventurous and alternative and complex, kind of picking back up the scholarship that comics for children lost post-Code with Wortham, which Gwen and Michelle's introduction to this piece does such a fabulous job of comprehensively engaging with that history and how it affected comics for children. But if we're going to think about that, then it's still so rather early for us to be developing any kind of canon. And I think so many of the comic scholars who are working today are working through these alternative comic forms in the way that they're styling and designing things to a respect of young readers, that they wouldn't want to pigeonhole the field of comics for children in a few texts. That all being said, if I had to throw out some canonical texts, or at least the kind of courses that I would throw into a syllabus and have thrown into a syllabus for children and young adults, I would, of course, other than American-Born Chinese, I think that the March trilogy, or at least the first book of March by John Lewis, Andrew Aiden, and Nate Powell definitely has earned that place. And I think I would also further throw in there El Defo by C.C. Bell, kind of as like core texts that deal with the structure, that structurally deal with adventurous comics and really complex ideas in a respectful way to young readers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then, of course, there's Raina Telgemeier, who looms over this field rather broadly, I think. And, you know, you raise a good point, Carly, when you mentioned that, well, things, you know, it's kind of a media or even a kind of comics within the medium of comics that is relatively young and it's still kind of forming itself. And, you know, speaking of comic studies broadly defined, like as a whole, I mean, this is a question I think that comes up quite frequently, right? Is there a comics canon? Should there be one? On the one hand, comics have been around almost as long as film, or as long as film, or arguably even longer than film. But when it comes right down to it, the acceptance of comics by the larger public, and especially within the academy, it's a relatively recent phenomena, right? And a phrase, and I don't want to key in on something that you may have used by accident, but you used the phrase alternative comics. And when people are doing this, one of the things that I found in terms of this question of a comics canon is that, you know, it's an academy question, right? I mean, all of us are academicians, and so these are the kind of questions, as annoying as they may be, that we tend to ask, you know, for better or for worse. And I find that by and large, those texts that are loosely considered canon, or that are used over and over again, whether you call that a, you know, canonical act or not is another matter, are those that could be defined largely as alternative. In other words, not the mainstreamy stuff. Now, granted, there are tons of mainstream comics in comic studies that are used in the classroom and in terms of scholarship. But I think that most of the kind of comics or graphic novels that are the subject of critical attention, especially within, let's say, English studies broadly defined. In other disciplines, it's different. For instance, political science, sociology, communications is a different matter. But at least in terms of literature language studies, it's primarily those that are not mainstream, or in other words, primarily not superhero. And that gets me to a topic or a question for you, Gwen, is as one of the co-editors of this book, Graphic Novels for Children and Young Adults, what kind of response – you said it was voluminous initially. What kind of response did you get with submissions that did deal with what you would consider mainstream comics?
Well, the majority of people who put forward abstracts were teaching in children's and YA literature. And our field, too, developed right alongside the field of comics. And while sometimes they intersect, sometimes they also do not. And so for those of us who are teaching children's and YA lit to begin with, usually when we're putting together a syllabus for future educators, we're thinking about including books that we know can withstand challenges and make it into a classroom. We teach books that we know that kids like because of sales, but then we also teach books that are groundbreaking, avant-garde, interesting. In other words, we usually try to create a balance in that way. And so when Michelle and I received these abstracts, we were receiving, proposals for almost, in each category, a huge number of texts. Our job was trying to narrow it down and create a collection that would then represent texts that are used a lot in classrooms. And I'm thinking there of, Boxers and Saints, or Coraline, or, Smile, etc., which often make it into the classroom. But then we were also looking for alternative comics, and I'm using that term purposefully, like, for instance, Alexic's Ivy, right, which originally was published as a zine in Portland, Oregon, in the Portland, Oregon comic scene, and then ultimately was published in print form. But then we were also trying to look at comics in general that represented underrepresented groups. In fact, 11 of the 20 essays in this collection involve individuals from underrepresented groups, and the texts do. And our rationale for that as well is in children's literature, we are making a big push to make sure that children see themselves represented in texts. And so we wanted to use this collection as a way both that an established teacher who's had a lot of experience can go in here and find 5 or 6 essays that they might be able to utilize immediately with their students. But we're also hoping that people who are new to the field or are interested in learning more are going to be exposed to some comics that they might not otherwise have encountered and then can consider putting into their class. So I hope that sort of answers it. We were lucky to get essays that really were dealing with a wide range of comics, and what we tried to do was to create as representative a group of essays as possible.
Right. I guess what I was asking is, with those initial proposals that you got, how many people submitted proposals that dealt with mainstream comics, what you would consider mainstream comics? I'm
trying to remember. I bet Michelle would be much better at this because she has a better memory than I do. But I'm thinking that probably it's at least 70% initially. Okay. And in part, Derek, because even though we can look to creators like Yang and Tagelmeyer as being super important, there are a lot of other comics creators. I mean, we haven't even mentioned Sean Tan yet. And we got multiple proposals from individuals who wanted to write on The Arrival, which is probably, it's a book that Tan calls a picture book, comic scholars call a comic. But regardless, it's a book that almost anybody who's involved in literature for children knows about. So I would, if we're going to say, what's canonical, part of it is just teachers vote with their feet as well.
Right.
And The Arrival is a good example of that.
Yeah. Well, of the ones that you included in this collection, there's David E. Lowe's essay on Miles Morales as Spider-Man, and there's also Rachel Dean Ruzicka's essay on Lumberjanes. And, I would consider Lumberjanes a mainstream title. And I think those are the ones that did make it into your collection. And so That's gets back to this question of, what do we consider teachable? And, Gwen, you raised a number of points, is something that you guys who deal with children's graphic novels and comics have to consider that maybe the rest of us don't, is what can make it into a classroom in terms of other issues, right? So is this something that could potentially be banned, or how many parents are going to be pissed off if we use this text in the classroom?
Right. I mean, Edie Berland handles that really nicely in our collection, writing about, Telgemeier's drama and the censorship that surrounds that, for instance.
Right. Maybe a kind of a related question, and maybe a way of bringing Joe in, because I know that there is quite a number of digitized comics broadly defined that are more manga based. Gwen, you and Michelle make a really good point in your introduction, and I want to second what Carly said. I think that this is an outstanding introduction, not just to the collection, but to children's comics and graphic novels, young reader comics and graphic novels as a whole. And one of the reasons why I appreciate it is very readable. I have little patience for academic texts that are written in academese. And, academics are smart enough to know when should be smart enough to know when they're writing in a way that are going to exclude certain readers, certain audiences. You guys wrote it in a way that is intelligent, complex, but yet highly accessible. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. We really wanted it to be read by a lot of people. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of stakeholders, like parents and K through 12 educators, we really wanted to bring into this collection.
Mm-hmm. And one of the points you make in your introduction is something that I think it's easy to overlook, and that is that comics and graphic novels, or the phenomena that we have now, let's say, with there being so much of it, is largely due, maybe not entirely or mostly, but largely due to manga and how it really caught on in the United States, especially beginning in the 1990s. And one of the things I found interesting is that, that's a great observation, but I don't really see much discussion of manga in this collection. And I'm wondering, did you get many proposals that dealt with manga? Or do you all feel that manga tends to be underrepresented when it comes to those texts that are taught to younger readers?
Well, I can just quickly jump in and say we didn't get any proposals for it.
Wow,
at least
none
that
whatsoever?
I remember. I'm trying to remember, and I wish Michelle were here. These are the moments, because she's so good at this. But I don't think so. And the closest that we really got were a number of scholars in our collection mention it because they feel that more contemporary texts were influenced by it. But
Right.
It's not that we're aware that it's not there. And I think also part of that is that neither Michelle nor I at the time really were super experts in that. But believe me, if we had gotten some really compelling proposals, we certainly would have wanted to include that. But I'd like to open it up to the rest of you about whether or not you feel it. I think it is underrepresented, by the way. And I think part of that has had to do with censorship. But
So I'm sorry, what exactly is the question?
Do you feel that when it comes to comics and graphic novels for younger readers, that manga, maybe within the academy, I guess, is underrepresented? In other words, not as many people who study children's and adolescent graphic novels are really paying attention to manga.
Well, I think that is it is and it isn't true. It depends on which discipline you're in. The education people are better about this than the literary people are. Also, one of the things that has happened is that people who work in the departments where those languages are taught have started doing a really good job about it. And also, I mentioned education already, but specifically art education has been paying good attention to manga for young readers. There's a woman whose first name is Junko and whose last name I think is Ito, but I might be getting that wrong now. Anyway, she's a specialist in art education, and she's done a lot of really good stuff on manga comics. And you should also remember that manga has its own home for academic discourse. There's a journal called Macademia that has been around for many years now, has been kind of sopping up a lot of the really good scholarship on manga. So I think that might be one of the reasons that we're not seeing it, is because it's not published in the journals that we read.
And when you were talking, Joe, I couldn't help but think of something that maybe about 10, 12 years ago, we could say about comics in the children's and adolescent literature classroom, right? That the reason that it's not being taught more frequently is because not many people knew about it and they were aware of it, or they felt comfortable enough in order to teach it. I mean, I remember, again, over 10 years ago, talking with a colleague of mine who taught a children's literature program, and the only graphic novel that she taught in that class was Mouse. And I was asking her, I said, this is the one comic you choose for a children's literature course? I mean, it doesn't even strike me as kind of a text for younger readers in that way, and there's so many others. And her response was, I really don't know much about comics, but I've heard about Mouse. And if we fast forward to today, I think you could say the same thing about manga, that many educators who teach comics, and not just, children's and adolescent comics and literature, but I think comics as a whole. One of the reasons I would guess that more manga is not used, and we have tons of it in translation, that they're just not familiar with it, or they don't feel comfortable enough in order to be informed to present it to their classes, which is understandable. But maybe this is something that over time we can find more common in the classroom as well as in the scholarship.
Well, I will jump in and say our librarian friends have been down the curve on this for almost 3 decades now. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was librarians who were at the front line of kids in the 1990s demanding this literature. And so, one of the things that I think if we had to do this over, I would probably solicit an essay from a librarian who was on the front lines. I mean, we think back to, I think in the essay we mentioned in 2002, that big Get Graphic in the Library campaign that wasn't just a one-day function, but I was talking to Amy Patty, who's a children's lit scholar, and she was saying that actually it was a year-long program with separate events at libraries around the country. Clearly, librarians have been thinking about this for a long time, and I'm hoping that more and more of them will write about this, because I think it really is important. But just speaking for myself too, as a scholar, I have always had anxiety about writing about cultures that I'm not deeply familiar with. I wrote about Hergé because I have had a chance to study French comics, and I can read French, which means that I've been able to read scholarship in French about French comics, and I've been able to read French comics in their original. So I feel comfortable writing about that. I don't feel so comfortable writing about non-translated, Japanese comics. Obviously, I couldn't, even if I wanted to. And I sometimes worry about translation and even original English language manga. Still, I think to write about that authoritatively, you need to understand something about the tradition. I know Pascal Lefebvre is one European comic scholar who's done a lot of work in it, and I really respect his work. But, I feel like for myself, it's a whole nother learning curve that I want to get down, but I haven't been able to get down yet.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. If you were teaching a world lit class, would you use Flaubert's Madame Bovary?
Sure.
Okay, so why not teach a comic, which is what manga is? I mean, manga is really no different from comics. It's just Japanese comics, or comics that primarily, not exclusively, are produced in Japan. In translation, why not teach that in a comic school?
Okay, because with Flaubert, I understand the tradition of the European novel, and I'm comfortable at looking at where that text fits into that tradition. But I can't say that I know just from my own reading, and I feel like an amateur here, and maybe Joe or Carly will want to jump in and have a lot more knowledge than I do about this, but there are multiple types of children's comics in Japan just at the outset. I mean, before we even talk about the larger sort of field of Japanese comics, I would want to know more about those subspecialties before I then presented the only book that my students might ever interact with in this tradition. I'd want them to be able to contextualize it. And I just don't, I need to get up to speed where I'd feel comfortable with that. But maybe, I've had other colleagues who have taken the plunge and have included text like that in their class and have had a great time with it. And very often their students are more in line with those sorts of texts, know more about them, and can bring something into the classroom. So I probably really should just be braver. So
I actually would happily jump in. I second everything that Gwen has said, but I think I also want to add too that it's not just linguistically the words in translation. I think of the context behind the visual semiotics that's happening within, or this difference happening in manga versus what's happening in Western comics. The particular direction your eye moves, the kind of visual icons that show up and are very readily understood in Japan and in other cultures that will Eastern locations that will frequently read manga, that are often completely lost on Western readers who are not familiar with that already. So I know that that, for example, I can tell you a name of a subset or subculture of manga. There's shoujo manga, but that's it. That's all I got.
Yeah, and what you guys are mentioning, I guess it gets back to an observation, or I guess more of a proposition than anything, of maybe the place or the lack thereof of manga within, and not just comics for younger readers, but also just comics broadly speaking, in the States, and that is that. People feeling uncomfortable in terms of introducing this to students, which again is very understandable. It's similar to, again, that example of a colleague of mine from about 12 years ago who was uncomfortable with comics as a medium, and so she didn't feel that she could really bring it into the classroom. And again, that's an understandable way to feel. I think make the plunge because, there are conventions in Franco-Belgian comics that are going to be outside of not only our students' awareness, but also us as professors and teachers' awareness, right? And so I guess dipping toes into water to get a little more comfortable with it is the first step. I
would definitely add too that, everything you guys have said about kind of like being uncomfortable and trying to be braver, and also just letting the kids take the way in the classroom. So if we're thinking educationally, as both you, Derek, and Gwen have mentioned, a lot of young people are reading manga, even if it's not necessarily showing up in classrooms. And I actually have a piece coming out in English Journal in September, in the fall, with Rachel Rickard-Rebellino and Christine Stamper, in which we kind of talk about this need for teachers to let go of the reins and to not be the most capable peer in the classroom when it comes to these forms. So whether that is comics in general, or as you've mentioned here, specifically manga, to walk up when you're using these books in your classroom and say, hey, I am not the most knowledgeable person here. Let's learn this together, or you teach me. And that ability for those young people to be able to take on that teacher reins will really change and influence the way that they engage in the classroom and literature more confidently.
That's a great point. And I have found in most of my classes, when comics come up, my students are much more aware and much more and better educated on manga than I am. Although usually it's manga that has an anime counterpoint, and they're primarily familiar with the anime version instead of the manga version. And, the same thing. And Joe, this is something that you may be able to relate to. I find the same thing in terms of my students and webcomics, right? When I talk about webcomics to them, there's certain things that they're thinking about that I'm not considering. I'll give you an example. Early this semester, we were talking in class about, I can't remember the context, but webcomics was involved. And several of my students mentioned Homestuck. And I said, what? And they said, oh, yeah, Homestuck. You don't know about that? And they explained it to me. They were excited about it. And so I looked it up afterwards. And, of course, they willingly and excitedly showed me the website. And then I swear to you, over the next several months, I kept hearing more people mention Homestuck, Homestuck, Homestuck. If they'd mentioned it around me before, I wasn't aware of it. But once my students educated me about what this actually was, and that's just one of them that they've introduced me to. I mean, Ava's Demon, Gunderkrig Court. I mean, these are the kind of things that I'm not aware of, but this is what they read. And they are comics, webcomics in this case, for, I think, a younger readership. But they were outside of my awareness.
Oh, I know that comic. Okay, yeah. My students told me about this comic, Derek.
Homestuck?
No, Homestuck. I just looked at it. I'm like, oh, yeah, that. Because a lot of my students had said, oh, you have to look at this comic. So it must be a thing with the young people.
It is. These young people today forming their own canons and syllabi.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. Well, I don't actually have a lot to say in addition to what Derek just said, but I thought that Dr. Grice's point was just so perfectly put. I mean, and it really brings us back to the point that you were trying to bring up earlier, the point of canon, that to a large extent, the discussions of should there be a canon, is there a canon, what is in the canon, what do we think about the canon, these conversations just annoy me because the fact is that a canon is something that happens at the intersection of texts and power. And so what happens is you have somebody who has power to decide what texts should be talked about, and that starts to form a canon. Or more importantly, and this is really pointed at what Carly was saying, is that a canon is really a function of what books we kind of involuntarily decide are the books that we're all responsible for knowing, so that we can have a conversation in the place where these academic conversations are taking place. Mm-hmm. And so then when we choose to reproduce those in our classroom, the justification that we give is we say, well, what we're doing is we're making sure that these people can enter into that conversation as well. And that may be well-intentioned, but it's wrong-headed. And what Carly is saying does a really beautiful job of diffusing the power that is behind the canon, the power that leads to the creation and the maintenance of a canon. And what she says is, well, don't come into a classroom with the idea that you need to be the repository of knowledge who is then going to dispense knowledge to the passive students. Be somebody who is more like a ringleader, somebody who's more like an explorer along with the students. And you are absolutely going to know more than they do in general, but be okay with them knowing more than you do, and make that part of the learning experience. I think that will help deal with this canon problem. And I think that Carly said it really perfectly.
Hey, I do too, but one of the things that's really complicates that is when your students have absolutely no knowledge whatsoever. I don't know if this is regional, but this last semester, for instance, we're looking at a pool here of 30 young people, mostly traditionally aged, and of that 30, only 2 had consciously been comics readers, and probably another 4 or 5 had read Diary of a Wimpy Kid once, and that was it. And most of them in their pre-test activities for the units that I do on comics said that they didn't like comics, they were resistant to them and hated them. And then, of course, yay, by the end, they loved them, wanted more. But I also think a lot depends on what classroom you're walking into. I would love that if I had a classroom where my students were active readers and could teach me. That's rarely been the case, sadly. And that's not necessarily the case with traditional children's lit, because most students have had, and I think all that does is it really speaks to, at least in the Midwest where I'm teaching, that there's a certain canon of traditional children's literature that's being taught, but not a lot of comics. So.
And that's true, of course, but it's also important to remember that the classroom does not have to be the only place where people develop knowledge about things.
Right.
For example, and I'm sorry, that sounded condescending. You know that better than I do, Dr.
No.
For example, I teach a course on fantasy, and I know that that's a class people sign up for, maybe a third of them sign up for because they love fantasy and they come in with a lot of knowledge. Mm-hmm. I also know that a good third, maybe 2/3 of them sign up for it because it meets a requirement and fits their schedule, right? So they come in with virtually no knowledge. And what I did is I structured that class in a way where the students, there's a long process for doing this, but the students determine 6 subcategories of fantasy that they are especially interested in and feel like they would both like to learn more about, and maybe some of them already know something about. And those 6 subcategories can fit what I, as a fantasy scholar, already have in mind, or they can totally not fit it. They can use terms completely wrong as long as they come up with a definition that makes sense to them. And then what will happen is within those groups, they'll start generating recommendations for other students in the class based on what those students say that they're interested in. And within those groups, then there will be a mix of people who know a great deal and people who know absolutely nothing about the subgenre that they're working in. And every semester at the end, I ask them, what do I do when I get people who are in a category and they don't know anything about that category? How worried should I be? And every semester they say, don't worry about it. It works out, because what happens is we have some time outside of class to go and teach ourselves a little bit about this stuff. We have access to all of human knowledge through the internet, so we're able to go Google some stuff. And we have people we can talk to who are enthusiastic about it and can point us in the right direction. So one of the ways to deal with the problem that you're, of course, right to talk about, Gwen, is that you can say, well, okay, here is the task that you have 2 weeks from now. It's to know something about this,
Right.
Knowing something about it at that point. And that helps decenter this a little bit, and it helps. Well, it definitely thwarts the idea of a canon in that fantasy class. We are constantly reading things I have never heard of before because the students are generating these suggestions.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. This is fascinating to me. Especially this question, Gwen, or I guess an observation more than a question that you raised, is that many of our students are unfamiliar with comics. They have almost no experience with it. And I'm about to say something that may sound like I'm trying to idealize the generation in which, or the area and the time in which I grew up. And I know Gwen and I grew up around the same time and started reading comics. The neighborhood that I grew up in and the people that I talked with in the 1970s, it wasn't unusual for kids, male and female, to know about comics. Whether they were avid comic readers or not, they knew about comics, if for no other reason, because they were prevalent in areas that they would frequent, like grocery stores, like drugstores, their corner 7-Eleven or Little General, places like that, right? But once you get into the 1980s and into 90s, where you have the direct market forming and the introduction of specialty shops, which a little more difficult to get to, and they're rarer, right? You have to be old enough to drive, or you have to have skills at conning people who do have driver's license into taking you to those places in order to get the comics. Now, when we have comics primarily centralized for purchase in either the comic specialty shops or bookstores, whether they be virtual or brick and mortar, I think that they're less prevalent, and so younger people have less exposure to them. So right now we are teaching a generation that are going to say things like, comics, how do you read those? Or I'm intimidated. I've had many students say, I'm intimidated by a comic because I'm not sure how to read it. Which direction do I go? Things that we may take for granted. And I find this ironic in that, Gwen, as you and Michelle point out in your introduction, we have basically a meteoric rise of comics and graphic novels that are devoted to younger readers, which is a great thing. At the same time, we have a generation of readers that aren't as familiar with comics as, let's say, their parents were, maybe with the exception of manga, and I think with definitely the exception of webcomics. And that's one of the reasons why I think that webcomics and manga are kind of outliers here when it comes to comics and graphic novels for younger readers, because it's what they primarily know.
Yeah, and one thing that we haven't mentioned is that cartooning is now actually something that people can do as part of their graduate work in art. You know, in the last 10 years or so, most major art programs have incorporated cartooning and comics. And so you have this first generation of comics creators who have been trained in comics. They haven't done them on the side or found one professor who will look at their work. They actually can get a degree in it. And so they're very often creating web comics while they're in school or creating their own comics, or some of them are getting contracts while they're in school. And many of them now are looking to children's comics because, as it turns out, someone is actually reading children's comics, you know, because the major presses have got imprints now and are actively soliciting comics creators to work for them. I think we're at a verge where much younger kids who are in grade school now, through especially the graphics imprint, because Scholastics is so, you know, heavily invested in selling in the schools. You're going to get maybe in another 5 or 6 years, kids coming into the classroom who've had much more experience. And part of that is they're being catered to now by people who are trained professionals, not just folks who like writing about comics or writing about childhood or writing for children, or someone like Jeff Smith, whose Bone got picked up by word of mouth. You're going to have more and more people like Raina, whom I can refer to by her first name, and you still know who she is, and Jean, Luen Yang, and others who will be probably very well known to our students. So it's not all that gloomy. It's just, I think we're going through a big transition period right now.
Yeah, and I would love to jump in if you guys don't mind. I think it also is important to think about who are the students that are in our college level children's literature and comics classes, and how they differ, as you were just there pointing out, Gwen, from the students who are currently within K-12 or who are going to be in K-12. My first thing that I've noticed over the last 4 years of infusing comics into my children's lit classroom has been that my students who kind of self-proclaim themselves as being excellent at doing school are the ones to first hate comics because they don't already know how it works. So that being uncomfortable is already too uncomfortable for them. But yet we have this curiosity with, as you pointed out, Gwen, you know, students who are much younger are seeing comics coming about it. They're selling a lot more. And even if not, they have certain levels of visual rhetoric from watching cartoons or other visual text surrounding them that they can bring to understanding and intuiting what's happening in comics. I know Pat and CISO has been doing some work in a school, a summer school program with students who are more struggling readers, for lack of a better way, and they have latched on to Miles Morales and that Spider-Man. Whereas I just taught Spider-Man this last semester, and it was an interesting shift to watch as I brought in Miles Morales, and I brought in Lumberjanes, Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur, and one more, Miss Marvel, into the classroom. And those students who had otherwise been relatively quiet, did not necessarily have the cultural capital, were at least drawing off their knowledge of the Marvel universe. And so we're starting to bring it in and fill in my other students on what they knew about the Marvel universe and explain how all of these texts, except for Lumberjanes, fit together.
Right.
And the dynamics in the classroom really shifted. So I think that whole point that Derek was making about like readers today or younger readers today saying like, oh, I have no experience with comics is just going to be happening so much more with people who are currently in college and are pre-service teachers to those who are just out of college as pre-service teachers. And so we really need to encourage them to let go of the reins. Because as you guys have pointed out, people higher than these, let's say millennials, older than the millennials have a more historic experience with comics. But people younger than the millennials also are having this contemporary growing education in comics. So we need to make sure that the teachers who are getting ready to go in the classroom know that just because they lack the knowledge because they didn't grow up with it in the 90s or early 2000s doesn't mean the kids they'll have in their classroom won't have that knowledge.
Yeah. And Carly, you mentioned those texts that you've used in your classroom, and you've pointed out two important phenomena, right? With the examples of, let's say, Miss Marvel, Lumberjanes, and the Miles Morales Spider-Man, you're talking about comics now that we're seeing more and more frequently, which we didn't, let's say, 20, 30 years ago, with characters that a broader population can identify with, right? Especially those who may not have been able to identify with a particular character or set of characters 25 years ago. So I think that is an impressive phenomena that is changing the dynamics of comics readership. Another thing is the mass media attention and to some degree, and not complete, but I think to some degree, the embracing of comics and comics culture to where it becomes so pervasive. And, you mentioned the Marvel universe. I mean, think of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The vast majority of students, I think younger students who come to comics are going to come to, let's say specifically Marvel comics, I think through the Marvel universe, even if they don't pick up a comic at all. But I think people become familiar with comics culture through the movies, the television shows, the games that, primarily are based on the actual physical comics in some form or another. And so that's going to be another dynamic that is thrown into this mix that's going to give a younger generation, let's say from us, a different feel and understanding of what comics is than what we have.
Well, Derek, that's so true what you're saying about Marvel. And I guess the one thing that I'll sort of wrap it up for us today is, first of all, I've learned so much from Carly and Joe and from you, Derek. I already have some ideas about things I'm going to do in the classroom that are different, even than the ones that I suggest in the essay that I write for this book about teaching. That's what's so exciting about working in comics, isn't it, folks, that everything keeps changing so quickly that it keeps us on our toes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I just want to thank both Carly and Joe for talking to us today. I think this is going to be a really enriching conversation for anyone involved in comics in general, but especially for those folks who are interested in children's and YA comics.
Thank you all so much.
And thanks to you and Michelle for editing this. It was a lot of work, and we really appreciate what a professional piece it is that you've done here.
Great collection.
Oh, well, thank you guys so much. And I really wish Michelle could have been here because she was such a big part of that and a big part of making it the awesome book that it is. But thanks a lot. We're so excited about this book and just about children's comics scholarship in general. I think we're really at a place where things are taking off. Wow, Derek, that was an incredible discussion. I feel like I learned so much from both Joe and Carly and from you about ways to approach children's comics in the classroom that I hadn't thought about. And it was also really exciting to have Carly and Joe talk a little bit about their process and also to just talk about how we really are striving to share these comics with young readers.
Yeah, I learned a lot as well. I mean, of the four of us, I was the one who was ignorant when it comes to the ins and outs of children's and YA comic scholarship. So you guys taught me a number of things. I really appreciate that. And I think that not only did we get to talk about some of the specific content of your and Michelle's new collection, but, we also talked about broader issues to consider within the Academy and when it comes to comics for younger readers. And, we could easily do another or two or three roundtables on this topic because I think that we only scratched the surface today.
Yeah. And, when Paul and I are doing our young readers show, after every episode, I always think, oh, we should have mentioned this. And there's these other things we needed to talk about, or we need to interview that person. So it's just a really great time to be writing about children's and young adult comics.
That's right. So we want to thank those guys again for being on the Comics Alternative and talking with us about this new book of yours. And Gwen, congratulations on graphic novels for children and young adults, published by the University Press of Mississippi.
Yes, and available at a bookseller near you.
That's right. And if you want to find great books like the ones that are mentioned in this collection of essays, then you would do well to head over to the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, and as Gwen pointed out at the top of the show, you will find impressive discounts on many of the titles that are mentioned in the bibliography of this collection of essays, and that's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about this roundtable discussion. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
You can also contact us by email at twoguys@comicsalternative.com, or you can get in touch with us individually. I'm Gwen at comicsalternative.com. And Derek, how can people reach you?
At Derek@comicsalternative.com. You can also find us all over social media, such as on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to the website, which is comicsalternative.com.
Wow, that's a lot of ways to get in touch with us, isn't it?
Yeah, so there's no excuse for people not to respond and let us know what they thought about this roundtable.
Absolutely.
And we do like to hear from you. And we hope you'll come back for our future episodes, special and otherwise. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Gwen. See you soon.